Audiences always expect the immortal screen cowboy to go out in a cinematic blaze of glory. But for Kirk Douglas, Hollywood's undisputed king of furious, unyielding masculinity, the final act was a crumbling prison of flesh. Crawling out of the mangled steel of a devastating helicopter wreck in 1991, he was convinced his sheer willpower had made him invincible. Then came 1996. A severe stroke hit without warning. It did not end his life. It permanently stripped away his most powerful weapon, his voice. The giant who used to roar at studio bosses was forced into absolute silence for his final 24 years. He was left completely helpless, watching his youngest son succumb to severe chemical toxicity and witnessing his own era being permanently buried. This is the factual record of nature's most ruthless sentence for a Western legend. Before the million-dollar contracts and the manufactured Kirk Douglas persona, there was Isser Danielovich Dembski, a kid freezing in Amsterdam, New York. Born to illiterate Russian Jewish immigrants, he was crowded into a rundown shack with 6 sisters and a mother worn thin by constant labor. Poverty in the 1920s, industrial Northeast was a physical ache. Survival meant securing enough coal to last the night. That early starvation replaced any childhood innocence with a permanent, hard-edged survival instinct. His father, Herschel, was a ragman, holding the absolute lowest rung on the working-class ladder in their town. He spent his days hauling a rickety wooden cart behind a tired horse, collecting discarded junk, old clothes, and scrap metal from people who looked right through him. The shame of sitting on that cart next to his father, being seen as the human equivalent of the trash they collected, left a permanent mark on young Isser. Instead of bringing the meager earnings home to feed 7 growing children, Herschel regularly drank away the profits at the local saloon. The only attention the boy ever received from his father came in the form of harsh physical discipline and complete emotional indifference. In that neighborhood, being an impoverished immigrant kid with a strange name made you an immediate target for every roughneck on the block. Isser learned very early that nobody was coming to save him, and the local authorities certainly did not care about a dispute in the Jewish ghetto. If he wanted to walk down the street without getting knocked into the dirt, he had to learn how to throw a heavier punch than the other guys. He turned his daily humiliation into physical fuel, developing a street fighter's mentality just to secure his right to exist on those sidewalks. He eventually channeled that raw aggression into amateur wrestling, using his heavy hands and broad shoulders to physically force open the doors of opportunity. Wrestling served as his grueling, sweat-soaked utility, a brute force method to secure a college scholarship and punch his ticket out of the slums. He spent hours on the mat, grinding his joints down and taking hits, learning how to leverage pain into a winning outcome. The physical endurance he built in those gymnasiums became the foundation for the punishing work ethic he would later bring to the film sets. But he knew that muscles alone would not erase the stigma of his background or open the doors to high society. He needed to completely manufacture a new identity if he was ever going to escape the shadow of the ragman's cart. He stripped away the name Isser Dembski, recognizing that it sounded too much like the dirt and poverty he was desperately trying to leave behind. He chose the name Kirk Douglas because it sounded crisp, authoritative, and like a man who owned the bank rather than the man begging for a loan. He used his famous dimpled chin, his intense stare, and his heavily muscled physique as a suit of armor to hide the impoverished kid still living inside his head. This physical transformation was a calculated business maneuver, building a hardened exterior that dared anyone in the casting office to question his pedigree. He walked into the studio system not looking for artistic expression, but hunting for the financial security he was denied as a child. When he arrived in Hollywood in the late 1940s, the studio executives were heavily invested in manufacturing polished, well-mannered leading men. They wanted actors who looked comfortable holding a martini glass, men who spoke with refined accents and never seemed to sweat on camera. Kirk simply did not fit into that neat, sanitized mold, and he refused to soften his edges to secure a steady paycheck from the major studios. He carried a visible chip on his shoulder, a tense, coiled energy that made the men in the executive suites deeply uncomfortable. Instead of trying to smooth out his rough working-class instincts, he decided to weaponize them and force the industry to deal with him on his own terms. The turning point came when he was offered a secondary role in an expensive, safe studio picture that guaranteed a massive paycheck. He flatly turned it down, risking his entire unproven career to take the lead in a low-budget independent boxing film called Champion in 1949. He took on the role of Midge Kelly, a ruthless prizefighter who betrays his friends, uses people, and climbs to the top of the pile through sheer, ugly determination. Kirk did not just learn his lines, he subjected himself to a grueling physical training camp, getting hit for real to ensure the boxing scenes looked entirely authentic. He brought the genuine hunger of the ghetto into the ring, capturing the exhausting, ugly reality of a man fighting for his life. The executives and the critics watched the final cut and praised it as a groundbreaking triumph of intense method acting. They handed him an Academy Award nomination, completely convinced that they had discovered a master theatrical performer who could perfectly simulate unhinged rage. But here is the cold, uncomfortable truth behind that legendary performance. The audience paid their hard-earned money to watch an actor, but Kirk Douglas was not acting. He was not simulating the anger of a desperate man with nothing to lose. He was broadcasting his own factual resentment directly into the camera lens. The Hollywood machine, with its bright lights and massive distribution networks, served as a highly lucrative therapy session for a man who never had the chance to process his childhood. Every vicious punch he threw on the set of Champion was aimed directly at the freezing shacks of Amsterdam and the wealthy kids who used to look down on him. Every sneering, hateful piece of dialogue he delivered was meant for the alcoholic father who treated him like an unwanted piece of scrap metal. He took the severe emotional neglect of his youth, bottled it up, and sold it to the studio bosses at an incredible markup. He did not invent the modern cinematic anti-hero out of a desire to change art. He invented it as a survival mechanism to keep the ghosts of his past at bay. This raw, unpolished ferocity turned him into a highly bankable commodity, generating millions of dollars for the men sitting behind the big desks. They realized that working-class audiences connected with a guy who looked like he actually knew what it meant to punch a time clock and take a beating. But relying on that level of genuine, unmanaged anger to pay the bills is a dangerous way to make a living. The studios demanded that he tap into that dark reservoir of trauma picture after picture, draining his reserves and pushing his physical limits to the breaking point. The armor he built was holding up for now, but a catastrophic twist of fate in 1958 was waiting to prove just how little control this tough guy actually had over his own destiny. By the time the calendar flipped to the 1950s, the major studios had figured out exactly how to monetize that raw working-class edge. They shipped him out to remote, unforgiving desert locations to shoot westerns in triple-digit heat for 14 hours a day. The executives stayed in climate-controlled offices while the crew choked on dirt and the actors rode unpredictable horses across rough terrain. He accepted these punishing schedules without complaint because the paychecks were finally large enough to build a permanent fortress between him and his past. He treated the film set exactly like a construction site, showing up before sunrise, taking the physical hits, and delivering the exact product the bosses demanded. He built a towering reputation playing men who refused to bend, men who would rather break in half than ask for a handout. In the 1957 production of Gunfight at the OK Corral, the executives cast him as Doc Holliday, a hardened gunslinger rotting from the inside out. He had to portray a man heavily afflicted with tuberculosis, coughing heavily while still trying to maintain an intimidating, unshakable exterior. He nailed the performance because he understood the precise mechanics of hiding severe physical weakness behind a wall of manufactured hostility. The audience cheered for the tough guy on the screen, entirely missing the dark irony of a man pretending to be indestructible while his lungs quietly failed. 5 years later, he took on the lead role in Lonely Are the Brave, playing an old-school drifter who flatly refuses to accept the changing world. The plot follows an independent cowboy forcing his horse across a modern highway, only to be flattened by a commercial truck hauling toilets. The studio heads initially hated the script, seeing zero financial value in a story about an outdated man getting flattened by industrial progress. He fought tooth and nail to get the picture made, completely unaware that he was essentially acting out a grim prophecy for his own future. He thought he was just telling a gritty story, but he was actually demonstrating how easily a mountain of muscle could be crushed by blind, unfeeling machinery. He felt completely in charge of his career by 1958, dictating terms to the studio heads and commanding top dollar for his physical labor. But the illusion of having total control over your own destiny is the biggest lie a working man can tell himself. In March of that year, the famous producer Mike Todd invited him to board a private, twin-engine aircraft for a quick publicity trip across the country. The plane was fully fueled, the flight plan was filed, and the itinerary was meant to be another standard victory lap for the Hollywood elite. The only thing standing between the actor and the boarding stairs was the sharp intuition of his wife, Anne, who firmly told him to stay home. They engaged in a fierce shouting argument in their driveway, with him insisting on his obligation to the producer and her flatly refusing to let him go. He eventually backed down, choosing to swallow his pride rather than continue the exhausting fight with his spouse. The private aircraft took off without him, heading directly into a severe storm system that the pilots failed to properly navigate. The plane went down hard in the mountains of New Mexico, scattering metal across the rocks and leaving absolutely zero survivors among the passengers or crew. He woke up the next morning, poured a cup of coffee, and turned on the radio to hear that the flight he was supposed to be on had become a smoking crater. The news hit him like a physical blow to the chest, instantly stripping away every ounce of swagger he had built up over the decade. He had to face the cold, unfeeling mathematics of chance. The wealthy producer was gone, and the ragman's son was still breathing. There was no logical explanation, no divine reasoning, just a completely random roll of the dice that determined who went into the ground and who went to work. That realization planted a heavy, quiet terror inside his head, a condition the medical professionals referred to as survivor's guilt. He could not process why he was spared, so he decided the only way to balance the cosmic ledger was to work himself to the absolute bone. He immediately ramped up his production schedule to a frantic, unsustainable pace, signing contracts for consecutive films without scheduling a single day of rest. Over the course of his career, he churned out more than 90 feature films, treating each project like a desperate race against an invisible clock. He dragged his aging frame through grueling action sequences, demanding that the directors keep the cameras rolling long after the younger crew members were ready to drop. He was not acting out of a passion for the craft anymore. He was running full speed from the ghost of that 1958 flight. If he kept moving, kept earning, and kept dominating the screen, he thought he could prove to the universe that keeping him around was a worthwhile investment. To guarantee he never had to answer to another studio boss again, he took his hard-earned capital and formed his own independent production company. He bypassed the traditional corporate names and called it Brenna Productions, deliberately naming the entire enterprise after his illiterate immigrant mother. This was a calculated public tribute to the woman who suffered in the slums, but it was also a heavy final insult directed at his father. He permanently erased Herschel the Ragman from the narrative, ensuring that the family legacy would be defined by his own financial triumph and his mother's name. The industry press hailed him as a trailblazing businessman who was finally putting the power back into the hands of the working actors. The public relations machine spun him into a working-class hero when he used his new company to openly hire Dalton Trumbo to write the script for Spartacus. Trumbo had been blacklisted by the Hollywood executives for his political ties, entirely banned from earning a living in the film industry for years. By openly giving the writer full screen credit, the actor dealt a fatal blow to the studio blacklist and forced the old guard to change their rules. The newspapers praised his courage, painting him as a fearless champion of the little guy who used his own money to fight corporate injustice. But the reality on the actual film set was a sharp, uncomfortable contrast to the noble image being sold to the public. Behind the closed doors of the production office, the man who defeated the tyrannical studio system immediately became the exact thing he had overthrown. The terrifying lack of control he felt when that plane went down in 1958 mutated into an obsessive need to dictate every single detail on his sets. He micromanaged the lighting, rewrote dialogue on the spot, and frequently subjected his hired directors to humiliating public dressing downs in front of the entire crew. If a technician made a mistake, they were gone. If a co-star missed their mark, they caught the full force of his unmanaged temper. He demanded absolute perfection from laborers who were just trying to earn their weekly wage and get home to their families. His reputation in the industry shifted from a tough, reliable leading man to a notoriously difficult boss who ruled by sheer intimidation. He justified his harsh methods by pointing to the box office returns, arguing that the financial results excused the hostile working environment he created. He was treating the crew the exact same way the studio executives had treated him, squeezing every drop of value out of them to protect his investment. The working-class kid who fought his way out of the ghetto had finally built his own empire, only to lock the gates and start cracking the whip himself. He thought holding all the power would make him feel secure, but the constant anxiety of maintaining that control only tightened the knot in his chest. This suffocating need for dominance inevitably spilled out of the production lot and fractured the foundation of his own household. He cycled through 2 marriages, unable to turn off the demanding dictatorial persona when he walked through his own front door. He engaged in numerous highly publicized affairs with younger women, treating the commitment of marriage with the same casual disregard the studios showed toward their aging stars. He was desperately trying to validate his own existence, using money, influence, and physical conquest to drown out the lingering fear of his own mortality. The man had conquered the entire entertainment industry, but he was entirely incapable of sitting quietly in an empty room. The Hollywood machine celebrated his ruthlessness because it kept the theaters full, entirely ignoring the toll it was taking on the human being under the lights. He spent 3 solid decades running a dictatorship, convinced that his wealth and his iron will had successfully barricaded him against the random cruelty of the world. He thought he had outworked the odds, outsmarted the system, and permanently outrun the ghost of that doomed flight in New Mexico. But the bill for pushing a human body and mind to their absolute limits never gets lost in the mail. It just waits for the right moment to arrive. In 1991, the sky over California would violently remind him that gravity and twisted metal do not care how many times your name is painted on a marquee. By the time a working man reaches his mid-70s, the heavy lifting of life is supposed to be permanently finished. The unspoken rule dictates that aging workers should quietly collect their pensions, retreat to a comfortable chair, and let the younger generation handle the grueling shifts. But stepping away from the daily grind requires a level of internal quiet that the former studio heavyweight simply did not possess. He was 75 years old in 1991, still treating every waking hour like a high-stakes negotiation, completely refusing to hand over his leverage. He continued to carry himself with that rigid, unyielding posture, convinced that his sheer force of habit could hold back the natural decay of his own machinery. On a clear afternoon in February of that year, he boarded a private Bell Ranger helicopter for what was scheduled to be a standard transport. This was a routine perk of the Hollywood elite, a way to bypass the congested freeways and conduct business efficiently above the smog. He sat securely in the passenger seat, next to a seasoned pilot, completely comfortable with the familiar vibration of the engine and the smell of the exhaust. They lifted off from Santa Paula Airport, a busy regional airfield nestled in an agricultural valley just outside the sprawling city limits. There was no warning light, no dramatic music, and absolutely no reason to suspect that his long streak of manufactured luck was about to run out. As the helicopter ascended steadily out of the valley, a small Pitts aerobatic plane was maneuvering through the exact same corridor of airspace. The traffic around these local airfields operates on strict visual flight rules, requiring every pilot to maintain constant physical awareness of the machines moving around them. In a catastrophic failure of visibility, the flight paths of the 2 distinct aircraft directly intersected at an altitude of just 40 feet. The stunt plane collided violently with the rising helicopter, tearing through the metal frame and severing the critical components that kept the heavier aircraft in the sky. The impact did not register as a cinematic explosion. It was just a sickening mechanical crunch of aluminum, steel, and shattering glass. Once the main rotor blades stopped functioning, physics immediately took over and pulled the crippled machine directly toward the unforgiving asphalt below. There were no safety coordinators waiting on the ground, no rehearsed camera angles to make the descent look heroic, and no stunt doubles to take the fall. The actor experienced the sheer, unedited terror of absolute freefall, plummeting toward the runway, trapped inside a rapidly disintegrating metal cage. The helicopter hit the earth with enough force to warp the chassis, pinning the occupants inside the crushed cabin amid the heavy fumes of leaking aviation fuel. The man who had played countless indestructible cowboys was reduced to a fragile passenger waiting for an impact he could not negotiate his way out of. The dust eventually settled over the tarmac, revealing a grim scene that local emergency crews rushed to secure before a spark could ignite the wreckage. Looking at the destroyed remnants of the aerobatic plane, the harsh reality of the collision became immediately apparent to the first responders. The two men occupying the smaller aircraft, a flight instructor and his student, lost their lives the exact moment the two machines collided. They were just young men, 31 and 18 years old, entirely erased from the ledger on a random weekday afternoon. Meanwhile, the 75-year-old movie star was pulled from the mangled steel of his helicopter, severely injured, but inexplicably still drawing breath. Paramedics carefully extracted his frame from the crushed fuselage, securing his neck with a brace and rushing him to the nearest trauma center for immediate evaluation. The medical X-rays revealed severe structural damage, including a heavily fractured spine that threatened to end his physical mobility permanently. He lay flat on his back under the fluorescent lights of the hospital, heavily medicated and entirely stripped of the authority he usually wielded over a crew. The executive who used to dictate terms to directors and fire technicians on a whim could not even sit up to drink a glass of tap water. His famous iron jaw and muscular physique offered zero protection against the unfeeling reality of an aviation disaster. The physical agony of the fractured vertebrae was severe, but the psychological toll of lying in that hospital bed proved to be far more punishing. As he stared quietly at the ceiling of his recovery room, the old ghost from the 1958 New Mexico flight returned to stand at the foot of his mattress. He was forced to look at the cold facts. Two young men with decades ahead of them were gone, while an old man who had lived a highly privileged life was spared. The mathematics of survival offered no logical comfort. The massive fortune he had accumulated over decades meant absolutely nothing in the face of a random mechanical slaughter. He had spent 30 years running from the ghost of the New Mexico flight, only to realize you cannot outwork gravity. This existential crisis cracked the entire foundation of the tough guy philosophy he had relied on since his days fighting in the working-class slums. He realized that his lifelong strategy of projecting anger, hoarding power, and intimidating his colleagues was ultimately a completely useless defense mechanism. You cannot intimidate a falling helicopter, you cannot fire a broken spine, and you cannot buy back the futures of the two young men who perished on the tarmac. The realization hit him that the heavy armor he wore to keep the world at bay was beginning to fracture. The invincible Hollywood giant was forced to accept that underneath the muscle and the money, he was still just a vulnerable laborer. He faced a grueling, extended period of physical rehabilitation, having to learn how to move his damaged body without relying on his former athletic strength. The physical therapy was not a neat, cinematic montage. It was a slow, frustrating grind of small steps, heavy sweating, and learning to tolerate persistent discomfort. He had to depend entirely on the patience and expertise of the nursing staff, forcing him to drop his dictatorial habits and actually listen to instructions. He began to express genuine gratitude to the medical workers who adjusted his braces and monitored his vitals, recognizing the real value of their steady labor. The brawler, who used to solve problems with his fists, was finally learning how to say thank you to the people carrying his weight. Stripped of his physical dominance, he started looking for a new framework to understand his place in a world that had inexplicably spared him twice. He bypassed the trendy Hollywood advisors and went directly back to the roots he had actively tried to bury when he changed his name decades earlier. He began studying the Torah, spending quiet hours, sitting with rabbis, to decipher the ancient texts he had ignored since his difficult childhood in Amsterdam. He was not memorizing the scripts to prepare for a biblical role. He was genuinely searching for instructions on how to handle the heavy burden of being a survivor. The ancient words offered him a practical way to process his guilt, shifting his focus away from his own ego and toward the community around him. Unable to rely on his physical dominance, he decided to systematically dismantle the immense fortune he had spent a lifetime fiercely protecting. He started liquidating major assets, quietly funneling millions of dollars away from his personal accounts and directly into charitable foundations. He funded the construction of hundreds of playgrounds in neglected urban neighborhoods, making sure kids from the slums had safe places to stand and play. He remembered the grinding poverty of his youth and decided that his capital was better spent on asphalt and swing sets than on maintaining an oversized estate. The man who used to hoard control was now actively trying to give his power away to people who actually needed a break. His newly found gratitude toward the medical community translated into massive financial support for hospitals and specialized care centers across the state. He purchased advanced diagnostic equipment for clinics, ensuring that other working families would have access to the exact same resources that kept him breathing. He funded entire wings dedicated to neurological and physical rehabilitation, specifically targeting the grueling recovery processes he had just endured firsthand. This systematic redistribution of wealth became known in philanthropic circles not as a corporate tax write-off, but as a deliberate attempt to settle a personal moral debt. He was using the wages earned from a lifetime of playing violent men to quietly rebuild the broken bodies of everyday citizens. The industry press eventually took notice of this transformation, expecting him to leverage his charitable work into a highly publicized, triumphant Hollywood comeback. But he had absolutely no interest in returning to the chaotic, ego-driven environment of the production lots that he used to rule with an iron fist. He walked with a noticeable stiffness now, a permanent physical reminder of the metal hardware holding his lower vertebrae together. He no longer felt the need to hide his limitations or project a false sense of vitality when the cameras were pointed in his direction. The heavy armor had been discarded, leaving behind a much quieter, more grounded man who was finally comfortable with his own physical decline. The public saw an older, wiser figure who had gracefully accepted the consequences of aging and the fragile nature of his own existence. He wrote books detailing his experiences, openly discussing the terrifying reality of the crash and the severe depression that followed the hospital stay. He stripped away the mythology of the movie star, talking directly to everyday men about the uselessness of holding on to anger and the importance of finding peace. He managed to rebuild his routine on a much more stable, honest foundation, abandoning the toxic standards that defined his early career. It seemed like the ragman's son had finally found a safe harbor after a lifetime of fighting the current. He spent the first half of the 1990s adjusting to this slower pace, enjoying his family, and focusing his remaining energy on his philanthropic duties. He had survived the poverty of his childhood, outworked the ruthless studio bosses, and walked away from 2 catastrophic aviation disasters. By all logical measures, he had earned a peaceful retirement, a quiet concluding chapter free from the physical trauma that had defined his working years. The universe had already extracted a heavy toll from his body, and he firmly believed that his tab was finally settled. But human biology operates on its own unyielding schedule, completely indifferent to a man's personal growth or charitable contributions. The physical recovery from the fractured spine was an impressive display of endurance, but it was ultimately just a prelude to a much harsher sentence. The real tragedy of outliving your peers and surviving major accidents is that you are left behind to face the slow, systematic decay of your own internal wiring. You can reinforce a broken back with titanium screws, but you cannot buy a shield to protect the delicate vessels running through your brain. He was about to learn that the absolute worst betrayal does not come from a studio executive or a falling piece of machinery. The final, most devastating blow would come quietly from within his own biology, setting the stage for a 24-year prison sentence. The year 1996 arrived, finding the old actor approaching his 80th year with the quiet endurance of a retired heavyweight. He had survived the crushing poverty of his youth, the punishing grind of the studio system, and the mechanical violence of a falling helicopter. He had every practical reason to believe that the worst chapters of his physical trials were permanently closed and filed away. But deep within the complex wiring of his nervous system, a microscopic blockage was quietly forming to deliver a blow no amount of grit could deflect. It was a silent internal electrical failure that instantly severed the connection between his mind and his muscles, permanently disabling his voice. For a man who had spent over 50 years commanding attention and dictating terms, the sudden absence of speech was a psychological solitary confinement. His entire empire, every dollar he earned and every ounce of authority he wielded on set, was built entirely on the power of his vocal cords. He was the heavyweight who shouted down greedy executives, roared through epic historical battles on screen, and verbally dominated any room he walked into. Now the heavy, imposing baritone that had intimidated directors and captivated millions was completely gone, replaced by an unrecognizable slurred murmur. The legendary tough guy, the man who used his words like a blunt instrument to shape his reality, was reduced to pointing and grunting in sheer frustration. The hospital recovery room became his new microscopic universe, completely stripped of the glamour and deference he was accustomed to receiving from the studios. There were no assistants rushing to fulfill his requests, no publicists spinning the narrative, just the cold clinical reality of a broken machine needing repair. He was introduced to specialized speech therapists, working professionals who treated him not as Hollywood royalty, but as a standard patient with a severe neurological deficit. The daily rehabilitation routine was an exhausting grind that required him to abandon every shred of his carefully maintained ego just to participate. He had to sit in a plain chair and practice shaping his mouth around basic vowels, struggling to replicate the sounds of a toddler learning to speak. The sheer physical effort required to force a single coherent word past his paralyzed lips left him completely drained and soaked in heavy sweat. He spent hours staring at his own reflection in a small hand mirror, watching the drooping muscles on the right side of his face refuse to cooperate. The actor who had obsessed over lighting, camera angles, and maintaining a flawless profile, now had to confront a visage that was visibly and permanently altered. His heavy hands gripped the armrests of his chair as he tried to force his body into submission through sheer, concentrated willpower. But you cannot intimidate a damaged neural pathway, and the intense anger that had fueled his rise from the slums was entirely useless against a stroke. The heavy silence of his recovery gave him far too much time to think, allowing a dark, suffocating depression to settle firmly over his mind. The isolation of being trapped inside his own head eventually pushed his practical problem-solving instincts toward a terrifying and methodical conclusion. He looked at the long, grueling road of therapy ahead and the permanent loss of his autonomy, deciding that the cost of doing business was simply too high. Hidden in his private quarters, he retrieved a heavy piece of steel, looking for a quick exit from the daily humiliation. He was fully prepared to dictate his final terms and bypass the agonizing physical decay. But as the cold metal caught the edge of his front teeth, a sharp, jarring jolt of pain broke his dark trance. That minor, jarring physical sensation broke the heavy trance of his dark resolution, forcing him to pause and reassess the mechanics of his final exit. A bizarre, completely irrational thought pushed its way to the front of his mind. If he miscalculated the angle, the heavy steel would ruin his expensive dental work. The sheer absurdity of the situation hit him with the force of a freight train, completely derailing his meticulously planned departure. Here was a dying giant, a man fully committed to ending his own existence, suddenly paralyzed by the fear of looking unkempt in his last moments. The legendary movie star's deep-seated vanity, the exact same superficial obsession that the industry had drilled into him for decades, had inadvertently saved his life. He lowered the heavy weapon, the dark tension in the room suddenly shattering into a heavy, exhausted relief that left him gasping for air. He started to chuckle, a rough, broken sound that slowly built into a fit of genuine, uncontrollable laughter at his own ridiculous human contradictions. He locked the weapon away, accepting that he was not going to take the easy way out, and returned to his grueling speech therapy with a grounded sense of purpose. Just 2 months after the stroke nearly ended him, the Hollywood establishment announced that they intended to present him with an honorary Academy Award. The timing was highly problematic, creating an intense wave of anxiety among the event organizers and the studio executives who managed the broadcast. The industry is built entirely on the illusion of perfection, heavily reliant on projecting youth, beauty, and unshakable confidence to the paying public. The unwritten rule of the business dictates that aging stars who suffer severe physical decline should quietly fade from view, preserving their iconic image in the archives. The machine wanted to honor the indestructible cowboy of the 1950s, entirely dreading the prospect of putting a paralyzed old man on live television. The general expectation was that he would accept the heavy golden statue via a pre-recorded, heavily edited video message from the safety of his living room. But stepping away from the spotlight and hiding his scars was completely contrary to the new, brutally honest reality he was building for himself. He informed the Academy that he would be attending the ceremony in person, and more importantly, he would be walking out onto that stage to accept the award himself. His close associates quietly tried to talk him out of it, warning him about the potential for a heavy, highly public embarrassment in front of his peers. But the old brawler had made up his mind, viewing this appearance as a necessary public declaration of survival, deliberately choosing to shatter the illusion of invincibility. When his name was announced at the auditorium, the entire crowd of polished executives and flawless younger stars immediately rose to their feet. He stepped out from the wings, moving with a slow, deliberate stiffness that contrasted sharply with the athletic swagger of his prime earning years. Millions of viewers watched from their living rooms, entirely accustomed to seeing him ride hard across the desert or swing an axe on the deck of a ship. Instead, they saw an 80-year-old man fighting his way across the stage, leaning on sheer stubbornness rather than physical strength to command the room. He reached the microphone, gripping the heavy wooden podium to steady his frame, and looked out at the sea of faces representing the industry he once ruled. He leaned into the microphone and began to speak, making absolutely no effort to hide the severe limitations of his damaged vocal cords. His words were slow, slurred, and heavily labored, requiring him to physically force every single syllable out into the open air just to be understood. His jaw pulled sharply to one side, completely exposing the facial paralysis that a younger, prouder version of himself would have paid millions to conceal. It was a factual, unfiltered display of human frailty broadcast live to a global audience obsessed with artificial perfection and surgical enhancements. But as he painstakingly pushed through his brief remarks to thank his family, the nature of the uncomfortable moment shifted dramatically. The audience realized they were not watching a former star failing to speak. They were watching a man succeeding in a brutal, exhausting physical fight just to say thank you. That brief, difficult speech did more to redefine the concept of a Hollywood tough guy than all the feature films he had ever produced. For decades, he had sold the public a manufactured version of masculinity, a rigid stoicism that demanded men hide their pain and never show a single drop of weakness. He had played characters who took hits without flinching, setting an impossible, toxic standard for the working men sitting in the dark theaters. But standing on that stage in 1996, struggling to form basic sentences, he offered a completely different, infinitely more honest definition of what it means to be strong. He demonstrated that true endurance is not about maintaining a flawless exterior when the cameras are rolling and the lighting is perfect. Real courage is having your physical capabilities stripped away, having your pride severely dented, and still refusing to hide in the shadows when your shift is called. He took the very thing the industry feared the most, aging, illness, and the inevitable decay of the human machine, and dragged it directly into the bright spotlight. He simply stood there, a damaged, surviving laborer, presenting his factual reality without a script or a stunt double to protect him from the critics. When he finally clutched the heavy statue and turned to slowly walk off the stage, the applause was a quiet, genuine recognition of a man bearing his scars with absolute dignity. The Iron Man facade was finally gone, replaced by something entirely authentic, visibly flawed, and completely real. He had finally made peace with his own physical limitations, convinced that the worst of his personal trials were permanently behind him. But the entertainment industry is not a contained entity. Its toxic demands inevitably bleed through the walls of the family home and infect the next generation. He had survived the machinery of Hollywood, the aviation accidents, and his own biology, only to realize that the most devastating blow was not going to strike his own body. The final tragedy of his long existence was already moving through the veins of his own children, preparing to teach him the absolute limits of a father's influence. The machinery of the entertainment industry does not just chew up the men who sign the contracts, it violently shakes the foundations of the homes they return to. A man cannot spend 14 hours a day operating as a ruthless dictator on a film set and suddenly turn into a soft, understanding father at the dinner table. The heavy, unforgiving philosophy of the tough guy, the absolute refusal to show weakness, bled directly into the drywall of the Douglas household. He raised his 4 sons in the massive, suffocating shadow of a cinematic gladiator, silently demanding that they match his impossible iron-jawed standard. The children of Hollywood royalty are often handed immense wealth, but they are also handed a crushing psychological bill that eventually comes due. Growing up with a father who fundamentally views the world as a boxing ring leaves very little room for a child to safely stumble or fail. He expected his boys to be tough, to take the hits without complaining, and to conquer their own corners of the world through sheer force of will. But the capital and influence he hoarded could not protect his children from the specific isolating pressure of carrying a famous last name. They were expected to dominate the same industry that their father had wrestled into submission, stepping onto a battlefield they had no natural desire to fight on. The toxic standard of masculinity that kept the old man alive during the studio era proved to be a heavy, suffocating blanket thrown over his own bloodline. His eldest son, Michael, absorbed the ruthless, calculating business instincts of his father with a terrifying exactness. Michael watched the old man manipulate executives, hoard resources, and use every available piece of leverage to protect his own career interests. He learned early on that loyalty and sentimentality were useless liabilities in a town that only respects profit margins and box office returns. The father thought he was teaching his boy how to survive the wolves of the industry, completely unaware he was actively sharpening the teeth of his own replacement. That cold, practical education would eventually circle back and strike the aging actor where he was most vulnerable, shattering a dream he had protected for over a decade. Throughout the 1960s, the old brawler held onto a singular burning ambition that had absolutely nothing to do with riding horses or swinging swords. He had purchased the theatrical rights to a novel called One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, recognizing the raw, anti-authoritarian power of the lead character, Randall McMurphy. He poured his own money into adapting the story for the stage, starring in a Broadway run that failed to generate the massive success he anticipated. He fiercely held onto the film rights for 10 solid years, guarding the property as his definitive guaranteed ticket to a legitimate Academy Award for acting. It was his passion project, the one dramatic role he firmly believed would finally force the critics to respect him as a serious artist rather than just a muscular action star. As the calendar pushed into the early 1970s, the aging actor found himself struggling to secure the necessary studio backing to get the picture made. The executives looked at his graying hair and thickening waistline, refusing to gamble millions of dollars on a man who was no longer a guaranteed box office draw. Frustrated but determined to see the film produced, he made the fateful decision to hand the production rights over to his ambitious eldest son. He believed that keeping the property within the family would guarantee his position at the top of the call sheet, trusting blood to honor a decade-long dream. He handed over the keys to his most prized possession, assuming he was forming a partnership, when he was actually signing his own eviction notice. Michael took the rights, successfully navigated the modern studio system, and secured the necessary capital to put the picture into active production. But when the time came to officially cast the leading man, the son made a purely calculated, entirely unsentimental business decision. He looked at his father, assessed the commercial viability of an aging star in a new era of cinema, and coldly determined that the old man was a financial liability. Michael flatly informed him that he was simply too old to play the rebellious McMurphy, stripping him of the role he had spent 10 years waiting to put on film. The son took the part and handed it directly to Jack Nicholson, prioritizing the success of the picture over the lifelong dream of the man who raised him. The industry's vicious obsession with youth and relevance had not just sidelined the veteran actor, it had infected his own family tree. To be discarded by a faceless studio executive is a standard hazard of the trade, something a working actor learns to accept and fight against. But to be written off and fired by your own flesh and blood, using the exact same ruthless logic you taught him, is a uniquely devastating blow. He had to stand by and watch his own project go on to sweep the Academy Awards, entirely validating his son's cold, calculated betrayal. The old brawler realized that his immense power was an illusion. He could not even command loyalty from the boy who carried his name, while the eldest son thrived by weaponizing the father's harsh lessons. The youngest son, Eric, was completely crushed under the weight of those exact same expectations. Eric was not built for the brutal, combative reality of the entertainment business, lacking the thick skin and aggressive drive that the family name demanded. He attempted to step into the massive footprint left by his father, pursuing an acting career with a desperate need to prove his worth to a man who rarely showed approval. But the casting directors only saw a pale imitation of a legendary tough guy, constantly comparing the boy to a towering, impossible standard he could never reach. The frequent rejections and the heavy, silent judgment from his father quickly fractured Eric's fragile sense of self-worth. Unable to secure a stable footing in the industry and heavily burdened by the constant feeling of inadequacy, the youngest son sought out alternative methods to numb the pain. He quietly slipped into a severe reliance on illicit substances, using harsh chemicals to mute the overwhelming pressure of being a Douglas. The tough guy philosophy of the household offered absolutely no tools to handle severe emotional distress or psychological collapse. You were expected to grit your teeth, square your shoulders, and push through the pain without ever asking for a hand up. Eric could not manage that stoic facade, and his reliance on chemical relief steadily morphed into a destructive daily battle for basic survival. The aging patriarch, who had once thrown his weight around Hollywood to fix any problem his family faced, found himself entirely powerless against his son's condition. He could write massive checks to secure the best rehabilitation facilities, hire the most expensive legal teams, and try to shield the boy from the tabloids. But no amount of capital or industry influence can rewrite the broken chemistry of an addicted mind or force a man to save himself. The giant who had stood up to tyrannical directors was reduced to a frightened bystander, anxiously waiting for the phone to ring in the middle of the night. He was forced to watch a slow, agonizing train wreck unfold in his own living room, entirely unable to pull his boy off the tracks. Eric's life became a highly public, tragic cycle of brief recoveries, followed by devastating relapses, dragging the family name through the mud of the local police blotters. The old man had spent his entire career fiercely protecting his public image, trying to project total control, but his youngest son's struggles exposed the deep, unresolved fractures within the family. Every time Eric ended up in handcuffs or a hospital bed, It was a glaring factual reminder that the legendary father could not protect his own kin. The harsh working-class discipline that had carried the actor out of the slums proved completely useless when applied to a kid drowning in chemical dependency. The tools of the trade, anger, intimidation, and sheer force, were the exact wrong instruments for pulling a drowning man out of deep water. The absolute worst nightmare a parent can face finally arrived on a quiet summer day in 2004, permanently breaking whatever remained of the old man's heart. Eric was found entirely unresponsive in a Manhattan apartment, having finally lost his long, exhausting battle with severe chemical toxicity. He was only 46 years old, a man who had spent his entire brief existence trying to figure out how to survive in the shadow of a giant. The news hit the aging actor with a force far more devastating than any physical blow he had ever taken in a boxing ring or on a film set. The cosmic ledger he had tried so hard to balance through charity work was violently torn apart, leaving him with a debt he could never possibly repay. The old brawler was 88 years old when he had to put on a dark suit and walk slowly behind the casket of his youngest boy. The severe stroke he had suffered years earlier kept his words slurred and his face partially paralyzed, trapping his immense grief behind a wall of damaged nerves. He could not even deliver a proper roaring eulogy to express the terrible suffocating guilt of a father who manages to outlive his own child. He just stood there by the open earth, heavily reliant on a walking cane, a physically wrecked patriarch bearing the collateral damage of his own ambition. The absolute futility of his lifelong pursuit of power was laid bare on the manicured grass of the cemetery. What good is a fortune if it cannot buy back the air in your son's lungs? What value does an honorary Oscar hold when you are watching the dirt cover the coffin of a boy who just wanted you to look at him with pride? The Hollywood machine had taught him to value dominance, success, and invincibility above all else. But the natural world does not care about your box office receipts. Nature and biology had systematically stripped him of his physical strength, his voice, his prized film project, and finally his own flesh and blood. He had spent his life playing men who always found a way to win the final shootout. But standing over that grave, he knew the house always wins in the end. This was the brutal final cost of the American tough guy philosophy. He had already discarded his own armor, but the toxic standard he established had permanently crushed the boy trying to wear it. He had another 16 years to serve in the heavy, silent prison of his own failing body, carrying the weight of a century on shoulders that could barely hold up a jacket. The lights of the premiere nights had long since faded, leaving him to face the cold, unyielding reality of a world that had completely moved on. The final act was not about acting or fighting. It was simply about waiting for the clock to run out in a house entirely emptied of its ghosts. Living past a century is often sold to the public as a triumph. In reality, it was a silent sentence served inside a failing structural frame. The industry that bled him dry had traded its dirt lots for green screens, replacing practical danger with digital safety. They paraded him out for anniversary specials, treating the old brawler like a fragile museum exhibit to legitimize their corporate history, only to pack him away the moment the cameras stopped. The man who outlived his era watched the rugged trade he sacrificed his spine for turn into a sterile simulation. On February 5, 2020, at 103 years old, the engine simply stopped. The corporate machinery immediately issued prepackaged tributes, praising the indestructible cowboy while cleanly erasing the 24 years he spent trapped in a paralyzed shell. Hollywood took a hungry kid from the frozen slums, mined every ounce of his profitable rage, and squeezed him until the physical damage was permanent. The machine moved on to print the next star, leaving the man behind to shoulder the wreckage. Douglas survived the executives, the falling metal, and his own biology, paying the absolute maximum toll for his ticket out of the dirt.